This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Final Fantasy by using my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone. In this video I'm continuing with my Final Fantasy Limited set review. I've already looked at all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards, and in this video we're going to look at the blue ones. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about draft and sealed, I'm only going to be looking at cards that can be found in play boosters. This set has supplementary products that have cards that don't show up in play boosters. So if there's a card you think is missing from this video, it's probably not in play boosters. I will be looking at the bonus sheet for this set in their own separate video after I get through the main set. These are also my evaluations of these cards before it's possible to play this limited format, because the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that means I'll be wrong about some stuff, but as the format comes into focus, I'll make videos updating you about how the format has panned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the blue cards in Final Fantasy. Our first one is Astrologian's Planisphere, which for one generic and a blue is a rare artifact equipment with job select. That means when this equipment enters, you create a 1/1 colorless hero creature token, then attach this to it. The equipped creature is a wizard in addition to its other types, and has, whenever you cast a non-creature spell and whenever you draw your third card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and it equips for 2 generic. So this starts out as a 2-mana 1/1 with this ability, which is pretty decent. Most blue decks will be capable of growing this with non-creature spells, although drawing 3 cards in a turn is significantly more difficult. I don't love that this starts out as so inefficient, but I think the fact that you can move this around and put permanent counters on your stuff helps. Also, if your opponent destroys the Planisphere, you still have a token, and if your opponent destroys the token that you've been putting counters on, you still have the Planisphere, and that is pretty nice as a fail case. So I think this is pretty good, but I do think it's going to be hard to grow it a ton, but I do think it's a B-. Next up, it's Cargo Ship, which for one generic and a blue is a 2/3 artifact vehicle at uncommon. It's got flying and vigilance, and you can tap it for colorless, but you can spend that mana only to cast an artifact spell or activate an ability of an artifact source, and it has crew 1. As a vehicle, this isn't the worst thing ever. When it can attack, it's going to feel fine, and its ability to generate mana is pretty good, especially in a format where blue has a lot of artifact stuff going on. It's kind of like a vehicle version of Ugin Siren from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and that was an excellent card. So I think this slots in nicely in a lot of blue decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Combat Tutorial, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common sorcery. Target player draws 2 cards, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. I think adding a +1/+1 counter to Divination is a significant upgrade. It means that you get a 2-for-1 while adding to the board, and while what you add isn't major, we've seen lots of other spells lately that don't add to the board but give you something small, play better than expected, and I think this is going to be one of those. It won't always add to the board if you don't have anything in play, and you don't want a bunch of copies of this, but most of the time I think this will feel pretty good. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Dragoon's Wyvern, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Drake at common. It's got flying, and when it enters, you make a 1/1 colorless hero creature token. So this is an early candidate for one of the best blue commons. 3 mana, 2 power creatures that add an additional body to the board at a decent rate just always perform well. You're going to be happy running as many of these as you can get in blue, and I think that makes it a B-. Next up, it's Dreams of Laguna, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. Surveil 1, then draw a card, and it has flashback for 3 generic and a blue. So this is Think Twice-esque, and that is a decent card in Limited as recently as Foundations. The flashback here is more expensive, but in exchange you also get Surveil. I imagine this will be worth using in spell and graveyard decks, but it probably also isn't an important card in either deck. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Edgar, King of Figaro, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 4/5 legendary human artificer noble at rare. When it enters, you draw a card for each artifact you control, and the first time you flip 1 or more coins each turn, those coins come up heads, and you win those flips. So you can just ignore the coin flip part since it's virtually never going to come up. But that's okay, because even drawing a single card with his interest trigger will make him feel solid, and he'll frequently draw you far more cards than that. His body is big enough that you're likely to make it to your next turn to take advantage of that card advantage too. Obviously, it's going to be at its very best in a deck like blue-white, but I think most decks in the format will be able to draw one card with him often enough that he doesn't need like a full-on build-around grade, giving him a B+. Next up, it's Eject, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. This spell can't be countered. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Draw a card. Adding card draw to bounce is pretty sweet, and we've seen that several times in the past. The best versions of this we've seen before can also be cast without the card draw for 2 mana, or they've had cost reduction effects. This doesn't have either of those, but it still looks pretty good to me, giving it a C+. Next, it's Ether, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon artifact. You can tap it and exile it to add blue. When you next cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. Copying spells can be nice, but this does absolutely nothing but copy spells. I mean, technically, you can treat it as a 4 mana really bad treasure, but that's not even close to worth a card. Copying a spell can be, especially powerful spells, and blue-red does have a big spell theme, but this just feels way too narrow to me to be worth a slot in your deck in limited, even when you're into spells. I think it's an F. Next up, it's Go-Go, Master of Mimicry, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/4 legendary wizard at Mythic Rare. You can pay X twice and tap it, and copy target activated or triggered ability you control X times. You may choose new targets for the copies. This ability can't be copied, and X can't be 0. A 3-mana 2/4 is an okay starting point, and most limited decks are going to have enough activated and triggered abilities around for this to do something. Paying 2 to get an extra interest trigger or something sounds pretty good. And obviously it can get really silly in the late game. That said, you just don't always have the mana lying around to do it, and a big chunk of the time, this just will be a 3-mana 2/4. So I don't think I can go above a B-. Next up, it's Ice Flan, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 5/4 elemental ooze at common. When it enters, tap target artifact or creature an opponent controls, put a stun counter on it, and it is island cycling for 2 generic. This isn't too bad as a 6-drop that comes down and stuns something. That can be a big turn sometimes, and buy you time if you're really behind sometimes. It is expensive and a bit clunky, but that card would probably be right around a C-, and adding island cycling takes away some of the downside, namely that it's a card that does nothing until you get to 6 mana otherwise, so I think it's a C. Next, it's Ice Magic, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant with tiered, and that means you can choose one of the following 3 additional costs. You can pay 0 generic and return target creature to its owner's hand. You can pay 2 generic and target creature's owner puts it on their choice of the top or bottom of their library, or you can pay 5 generic and a blue and target creature's owner shuffles it into their library. So the baseline here is that it's a 2 mana to bounce a creature at instant speed. That's not an amazing card, since you can't always trade 1 for 1, and it's only limited to 1 card type. But the tiered modality here really matters, because once you go with Blizzara, you're spending 4 to straight up remove a creature, and that's always a nice removal spell in limited, and this has that earlier, cheaper mode that you can use. The upgrade to Blizzaga is actually kind of minimal. It's not that much different to shuffle your opponent's creature into their deck instead of putting it on the top or bottom. In fact, sometimes you'd rather make them make that choice. But if it's a really scary creature, I mean, generally you're going to be happier to shuffle it into their deck. But I'm just saying, in terms of like spending a bunch of extra mana, 8 total, it's not actually that great. Mostly you're leaning on Blizzard and Blizzara here, but this looks like a nice common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Ilmeg Pixie, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 fairy at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it attacks, you surveil 1. A 2-mana 2/1 flyer is fine, and this gives you some card selection and graveyard synergy. I'm giving it a C+. Next, it's Jill, Shiva's Dominant, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 legendary human noble warrior at rare. When she enters, you return up to 1 other target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and you pay 3 generic, 2 blue, and tap her, and you can exile her, then return her to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, activate only as a sorcery, comes back as a legendary enchantment creature Saga Elemental, a 4/5 called Shiva, Warden of Ice. The first 2 chapters make a creature unblockable until end of turn, and chapter 3 taps all lands your opponents control, then you exile Shiva and return it to the battlefield. This is probably the mana war with the most upside we've ever seen. A 3-mana 2/2 that bounces a non-land permanent is an excellent, excellent limited card, probably getting pretty close to a B+. Adding to the board and subtracting from your opponents just alters so many games, and being able to hit so many permanent types really matters. And you can even bounce your own thing for value. So she does all of the things that Mana War can do, but better, and then she has additional upside apart from her Enters trigger, because she can transform into a pretty big creature that has a few effects that are pretty good. I do think she's like less exciting than the other dominants once she transforms. Like Chapter 1 and 2 are only useful if you have something that can really take advantage of it. The good news is, with Chapter 2, you can target Shiva and make it unblockable, so at least there's that. But then Chapter 3 really doesn't do that much. It taps your opponent's lands down, which doesn't matter that often in Limited, and then she comes back to the battlefield, which means she bounces something again, so that's nice. But she's not like game-breaking when she transforms, but her baseline is incredible, and then she has this additional upside, and I think that's enough for her to be in the lower tier of bomb range, giving her an A-. Next, it's Louisoix's Sacrifice, which for 1 blue mana is a rare instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a legendary creature or pay 2 generic. Counter target activated ability, triggered ability, or non-creature spell. So, this is mostly a worse negate. It costs 1 generic more, but can hit abilities. But honestly, in Limited, hitting abilities isn't the most exciting upside ever, since you're usually going down a card and not taking a full one away from your opponent. But it does still have the negate mode, and this set does have lots of legendary creatures. Most decks will probably have one to sacrifice by the later stages of the game, and while that does mean you're 2 for 1ing yourself, it also means that you can counter a spell with very little mana up, and sometimes there are legendary creatures in the set that are expendable. It's still not very good overall, but I think it's a C-. I don't think it's quite a card that you hope you don't play, but it's also not a card that always makes the cut. Next, it's the Lunar Whale, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/5 legendary vehicle. At rare, it's got flying. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. As long as the Lunar Whale attacked this turn, you may play the top card of your library, and it has crew 1. So, this whale needs to be able to attack to go off, but crewing it is easy, and a 3/5 flying body can attack on a whole lot of boards, and once you start playing things off the top of your library, you're getting incredible value. You can even do it multiple times in a single turn. In the late game, this kind of card can just let you rip through multiple cards in your deck, because you can even play lands, although you are limited to 1 per turn, so hitting another one usually ends the chain. But it's not uncommon to play a bunch of spells in a turn with a card like this. And on top of that, it's like not a terrible vehicle as a baseline. You do generally have to wait a turn to get that value train rolling, and that probably limits it to an A-, but obviously it's an excellent card. Next up, it's Magic Damper, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant. Target creature you controls gets +1/+1 and gains hexproof until end of turn. Untap it. We've seen this exact card before, but with a different name. I'm talking about Shore Up, which we've seen a couple of times, and it's been a quality trick. 1 mana to blank removal, win combat in a decent number of situations, and on occasion, ambush block something is just really good. Really efficient for what it is. It's not quite as good as Snakeskin Veil in most ways. Getting a counter is just so much better, and the untap upside is kind of minimal most of the time. But it does play similarly. I'm giving it a C+. That's like a good grade for a trick, but this one is very cheap and good in so many situations, and we even have a spell deck in the format. Next up, it's Matoya Archon Elder, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 legendary human warlock at rare. Whenever you scry or surveil, draw a card, and you draw after you scry or surveil. So the great thing about this is that surveil and scry are just tacked onto cards all the time as some tiny silly effect. So turning that into a full card draw is a huge upgrade. So this can be a value engine in the right deck to be sure, and having a baseline of a 3 mana 1/4 isn't too bad. I do think it needs a build around grade, because it isn't like your deck automatically has a bunch of cards that surveil or scry, but if you can get like 4 or more, you're going to feel pretty good about Matoya. And in some decks, he can really run wild. The great thing is, the more you draw with this, the more likely you are to find more cards that trigger it. So I do think it's probably a D in your typical blue deck, but it has a ceiling of an A-. Even drawing 1 card with this will feel good, and again, sometimes it can go completely crazy. Next up, it's Memories Returning, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare sorcery. Reveal the top 5 cards of your library. Put 1 of them into your hand, then choose an opponent. They put 1 on the bottom of your library, then you put 1 into your hand, then they put 1 on the bottom of your library, put the other into your hand. And it has flashback for 7 generic and 2 blue. This is pretty wacky and kind of an interesting take on like a fact or fiction effect. You don't make a couple of piles and then your opponent has to make some sort of choice, or you have to make some sort of choice. Instead, each card that you reveal has a choice made about it, which I think is a pretty cool design. But basically, you pay 4 mana and you draw 3 cards, and that's pretty good. And your opponent has some say and is likely to keep you from getting whatever the second best and fourth best cards are that you reveal. But in the end, getting the first, third, and fifth best cards is still going to be pretty good for 4 mana. It is true this doesn't add to the board, and it also is true that it has this like extreme late game effect where you get to do it again, which is kind of sweet. But I do think this is pretty good overall just because of the card advantage it grants for the cost, so I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's the Prima Vista, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 5/3 legendary artifact vehicle. At uncommon, it's got flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, if at least 4 mana was spent to cast it, the Prima Vista becomes an artifact creature until end of turn, and it has crew 2. So a 5 mana 5/3 flying vehicle with crew 2 is not very good. This set does have some artifact stuff going on that salvages it a little bit, but when you pay for vehicles, you need to be getting something more efficient than this since it's a conditional creature. It hits hard to be sure, but also dies easily, and simply won't always be crewable. Turning into a creature when you cast a big spell is nice upside, but it's narrow enough upside that I don't love it. So this looks like a fairly underwhelming card overall. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Keykern Merchant, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 beast citizen at common. You can pay 1 generic and tap it to draw a card and then discard a card. And you can pay 7 generic, tap it, and sacrifice it to draw 3 cards. This ability costs 1 generic less to activate for each town you control. A 3 mana 1/4 with the first ability is like an adequate card. I mean, I don't love having to pay to loot. Looting is just so much better when it costs 0 mana than when it costs 1. You know, it's a lot easier, obviously, to leave up 0 mana. It's more likely you can play the card you draw when you're not paying mana to loot. But it is an okay effect to have. And then it has this nice late game effect where even if it didn't have the ability to decrease the cost of the ability by using towns, it would be kind of nice upside to have on a card, and it's going to cost 5 or 6 or sometimes less than those costs in a decent number of blue decks in the format. I mean, I think most decks in this format will have like 2 towns, so making it cost 6 isn't exactly far-fetched. Overall, this looks like a solid card, especially in like a blue-green town deck. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Quistis Trape, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 legendary human wizard at uncommon. When it enters, you may cast target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, and mana of any type can be spent to cast that spell. If that spell would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. This kind of creature almost always plays well. Obviously, it's not as exciting as spending no mana to cast a spell in the yard, but by the mid to late game, this will rebuy your efficient removal spells, and that kind of play ends up feeling great when you're adding to the board. You won't always be able to line stuff up where you can cast this and a spell in the graveyard, and it's super awkward and really terrible when you have to run this out because you just need something in play. But I think the 2-for-1 potential is accessible enough for this to be a B-. Next, it's Realms Sketching, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery. Create a token that's a copy of target artifact, creature, or land. So this is a clone that can typically copy the best permanent on the battlefield. Most of the time you won't want to land, but sometimes you really need 1 more mana and you can win, and in a pinch, this can do that. In addition to often being the best creature on the battlefield or whatever, it is a little worse than most clones since it makes a token. You know, it's not a creature that if your opponent bounces it, you can just play it again. If your opponent bounces the token you make with this, it's going to feel pretty bad. And double blue weighs it down a little bit, but I still think this is a B-. Next, it's Retrieve the Esper, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common sorcery. Create a 3/3 blue robot warrior artifact creature token. Then if this spell was cast from a graveyard, put 2 +1/+1 counters on that token, and it has flashback for 5 generic and a blue. So the Hill Giant up front is pretty bad. Like, that's like a D, and it would be worse if it wasn't an artifact in a format where that matters. Getting a 5/5 out of your graveyard later also won't feel like the best thing ever on its own, but the fact of the matter is that this does generate a 2-for-1 when you have the time, and being able to turn flooding out into a 5/5 is going to feel pretty good late. So the efficiency certainly leaves something to be desired. It's a clunky 2-for-1, but it still is one, and I think it's a C. Next, it's Rook Turret, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 artifact creature construct at common. It's got flying. Whenever another artifact you control enters, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. 4 mana 3/3 flyers have not been very good for a few years now. It's just too much mana for too small of a creature, and even when they have small upside, it isn't really enough. This is another one of those. Looting is something I love, but when it's attached to a 4-mana 3/3 flyer that only does it conditionally, and not when it enters, it's a lot worse. This card's not a disaster, but I don't think it's going to be an important card for artifact decks in the format either. Just one you run when you don't have something better. I'm giving it a C-. Next, it's Sage's Newliths, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common artifact equipment with job select. The equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has, whenever this creature attacks, untap target attacking creature, and is a cleric in addition to its other types, and it equips for 3 generic. A 2-mana 2/1 with this ability is not especially good. Sure, it kind of gives the creature vigilance, and sometimes untapping your other creatures can have real value, but most of the time this attack trigger is meaningless, and the creature we're talking about is pretty subpar. Still, you get 2 permanents here for 2 mana, and there's stuff you can do with both heroes and artifacts, but this is probably just a D+. Next up, it's Sahagin, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 Merfolk Warrior at common. Whenever you cast an on-creature spell, if at least 4 mana was spent to cast it, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and it can't be blocked this turn. We've seen this style of creature before, and they've never really impressed, and most of them key off of something else to get a counter and become unblockable, something that's easier to achieve. But yeah, the problem here is base stats are bad, and while it will feel nice when you can trigger it, it isn't like getting in with an unblockable 2/4 is going to feel busted either, and you can only have so many non-creature spells in your deck that cost 4 or more mana. It's the theme in blue-red to be sure, but cards that need you to trigger that sort of effect multiple times to be good, which this is, don't appeal to me all that much. So I think this is a D+. Next, it's Scorpion Sentinel. For 1 generic and a blue is a common artifact creature robot scorpion. As long as you control 7 or more lands, it gets +3/+0. So this is a very mediocre 2-drop early, but it's nice that it's at least an artifact in the set where that matters. And in the late game, it being a 4/4 is a legit upgrade. And if you're in a deck like blue-green, you might get to 7 lands ahead of schedule, making the upgrade even more exciting. That said, it's not really a 2-drop you're excited about or that you prioritize. I'm giving it a C-. Next, it's Side Quest Card Collection, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters, you draw 3 and discard 2, and at the beginning of your end step, if 8 or more cards are in your graveyard, you transform it. It becomes Magicked Card. Yeah, they did it. It's a 4/4 artifact vehicle with flying, and it has crew 1. 4 mana to draw 3 and discard 2, not great. But 4 mana to draw 3, discard 2, and get a 4/4 flying vehicle with crew 1 is an amazing deal. And if that's what this was, like you just played it and it's this vehicle with this enters trigger, it would be a really good card. However, it's not quite that good because there are going to be times, and I would guess more often than not, especially if you play this on turn 4, where you don't transform this right away, in which case you just played a card that doesn't really net you a card and doesn't really add to the board. That fail case is going to feel miserable sometimes. But it does dig you deeper in your deck, it loads the graveyard, it helps you get to those 8 cards. So I think it's a card that you end up playing, but I don't think it's amazing, giving it a C. Next, it's Sleep Magic, which for 1 blue is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. When it enters, tap enchanted creature. Enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, and when enchanted creature is dealt damage, sacrifice this aura. This is a surprisingly good removal spell for blue. 1 mana to lock something down is a great rate, and while your opponent might find a way to remove it by damaging their own creature, this is so cheap that minor downside is very much worth it. It won't always feel like you completely remove what you put this on if it has static abilities or activated abilities, but I think it's fine when a spell is this cheap. I think this is premium removal, giving it a B-. Next, it's Stolen Uniform, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon instant. Choose target creature you control and target equipment. Gain control of that equipment until end of turn. Attach it to the chosen creature. When you lose control of that equipment this turn, if it's attached to a creature you control, unattach it. The flavor win here is pretty funny, but it's going to be pretty difficult to get this to do what you want it to. Sure, stealing an equipment at instant speeds can sometimes result in a nasty blowout, but you're really dependent on your opponent having good equipment in play for it to be worth it. You can also use this to equip one of your creatures at instant speed, but that just makes it a bad, highly situational combat trick. This is way too finicky to be playable in limited. It's just a straight up F. Next up, it's Stuck in Summoner's Sanctum, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura with flash. Enchant artifact or creature. When this aura enters, tap enchanted permanent. Enchanted permanent doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, and its activated abilities can't be activated. This is basically a more expensive version of Sleep Magic. It does shut down the creature more because it turns off the activated abilities, and it can also go after artifacts, and it has flash. Those are all upsides, but costing 2 full mana more is obviously significant. But this also looks like a pretty good removal spell for blue, which I don't know the last time I saw 2 blue removal spells in a set review that I thought both were going to be a C+ or better, but I think that's what we have here. I think this one's a C+. Next, it's Summon Leviathan, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 6/6 enchantment creature Saga Leviathan at rare. It's got Ward for 2 generic. Chapter 1 says, return each creature that isn't a Kraken, Leviathan, Merfolk, Octopus, or Serpent to its owner's hand. And Chapter 2 and 3 say, until end of turn, whenever a Kraken, Leviathan, Merfolk, Octopus, or Serpent attacks, draw a card. So this will frequently just be a 6 mana 6/6 that bounces every creature except itself. And that's pretty good, although it's not something that's useful in every board state either, because you shouldn't really count on having other Krakens, Leviathans, and such. And there are times where your opponent is in a spot where it actually hurts you more to bounce all of your stuff than it hurts them. Even though you're the one adding a 6/6 to the board, they'll also get an opportunity to just play all the things that got bounced before you do in most cases. But you are still adding a big 6/6 with Ward 2 to the board. Problem is, it also has an expiration date, since it's a saga, but Chapter 2 is likely to draw you a card most of the time, should Summon Leviathan survive, because even if your opponent rebuilds their board, there's a good chance you can attack with this 6/6, which will draw you a card at that point. And overall, I think that makes this a pretty good card. I think some people will look at this and think of it as a bomb, because it does have a big impact on the board with Chapter 1. There's no doubt about it. But it's not the kind of impact that is always useful, and that's kind of the problem. It's an impact that sometimes hurts you more than hurts your opponent, and that's not really where you want to be. A card like this can just be really awkward, and also, it being a creature with an expiration date does limit how great it can be. But I think it's good enough to be a card that you do take pretty highly, giving it a B. Next up, it's Summon Shiva, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 4/5 enchantment creature Saga Elemental at uncommon. Its first 2 chapters say tap target creature and opponent controls, put a stun counter on it. And Chapter 3 says draw a card for each tapped creature your opponents control. A 5 mana 4/5 with this interest trigger would be a really good card in Limited, but this is both better and worse than that. Better, because it does it again on the next turn, and then even draws you at least 1 card on your turn after that. But worse, because this creature does get sacrificed after Chapter 3. In other words, you only get to block with it for 2 combats and attack with it in 1 combat, just like Summon Leviathan. Still, it does add to the board, however temporarily, while delivering what seems like more than a card worth of value to me, thanks to its first 2 chapters and the card draw trigger. So I think this is pretty good. I'm giving it a B-. Next, it's Swallowed by Leviathan, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. Choose target spell, surveil 2, then counter the chosen spell unless its controller pays 1 generic for each card in your graveyard. I like this. If you bin both cards, it at least makes them pay 2, which is enough to counter spells a decent chunk of the time. And if you're good at loading the graveyard, it gets even better, and generally scales as the game gets longer. When you can use a surveil for card selection because you already have so many cards in your graveyard, you don't have to dump them in the graveyard for this to be good, it's going to feel especially good because you're able to get value out of surveil independent of having to set up this counter spell, which won't quite feel like a 2-for-1, but it will feel like more than a card worth of value, giving this a C+. Next, it's Syncopate, which for an X and a blue is a common instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays X. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. X counter spells almost always make for quality limited cards, and this is one we've seen before. They tend to scale all game long, being pretty nice for countering on turn 2, but also pretty nice in the late game. The exile effect is great too, as this format, like all of them these days, has enough graveyard stuff going on for that to matter. It's still a reactive card, and there are times where you really can't make use of it, but I think it's a C+. Flexible counterspells like this tend to work out. Next, it's Thief's Knife, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon artifact equipment with job select. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and is a rogue in addition to its other types, and it equips for 4 generic. A 3 mana 2/2 just won't get in with a hit very often, but it's nice that you can move this later to other things that can take more advantage of it while still having the value of the token. Still, it is clunky enough to move around that I think it's probably just a C. Next, it's Travel the Overworld, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery with affinity for towns, and you draw 4 cards. 7 mana to draw 4 is bad. You need to be spending like 5 on this for it to feel good, and even then the liability of not adding to the board can be a problem. Still, this is certainly a good card draw spell if you're in the town deck. It does need a build-around grade though, since it's terrible in a deck that only has 1 or 2 towns. It's probably an F in a deck like that, and a C+ in a town-heavy deck. Next, it's Ultros, Obnoxious Octopus, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 legendary octopus at uncommon. Whenever you cast it on creature spell, if at least 4 mana was spent to cast it, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. Whenever you cast it on creature spell, if at least 8 mana was spent to cast it, put 8 +1/+1 counters on Ultros. A 2 mana 2/1 is dismal, but the stun trigger is nice, and in the late game, this can potentially turn into an absolute monster. You aren't that likely to have a ton of 8 mana spells, and like I've already said too, all of these cards that key off of 4 mana things, I'm a little bit skeptical about, because even in a format where that's the theme, having a bunch of cards that cost 4 mana or more that are non-creatures can be problematic. The good news is, even if you trigger Ultros once, the first effect that is, you're going to feel fine about what you did. It's not going to feel amazing most of the time, but you know, being able to tap something down and stun it on top of casting a spell is going to feel like a pretty decent turn 4, so I think this card's a C. Next, it's Valkyrie Aerial Unit, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a 5/4 artifact creature constructed uncommon with affinity for artifacts. It has flying, and when it enters, you surveil 2. So, without a decent number of artifacts in your deck, this is bad. But how good is like a 5 mana 5/4 flyer that surveils 2 when it enters? That's pretty good. It's a creature that can dominate the air while improving your next couple of draws and or loading the graveyard, and sometimes this will be cheaper, but it definitely has to be used in the right deck. I think this ends up being a D in a lot of blue decks, but it has a ceiling of a C+ or maybe even a B- in an artifact deck. Next, it's the Water Crystal, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare legendary artifact. Blue spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast. If an opponent would mill 1 or more cards, they mill that many cards +4 instead, and you can pay 4 generic and 2 blue, and each opponent mills cards equal to the number of cards in your hand. Yeah, this is a huge dud in Limited. Milling people is rarely viable, especially with a card that basically that's all it does. The discount doesn't move the needle in Limited, as we've seen many, many times on cards that don't add to the board but give you a discount, especially a small discount on what is probably only half your deck. That's just not worth a full card. And the mill effect this comes with asks you to have a significant hand, which isn't likely most of the time once you have 6 mana. If you just have 1 card in your hand, it is true that it will mill 5 cards, but you're still spending 6 mana to do that. You have to have really locked down the board, and the fact you played this on turn 4 instead of like a 4 mana 4/4 means you probably haven't. So it's a card that doesn't even really work that well with itself, because it's all about doing stuff that doesn't do anything to the board, and I can't get behind that. I think this is an F in Limited. And our last card is Y'shtola Rule, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 3/5 legendary cat druid at Mythic Rare. At the beginning of your instep, exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Then if it's the first instep of the turn, there is an additional instep after this step. This design is cool, but how good is it in Limited? Well, it does have a pretty miserable floor. It's a 6 mana 3/5. But it does do its thing the turn you play it in most cases, and if you can immediately rebuy an enters trigger twice, it's going to feel insane. And I don't think it's really far-fetched that you pull that off in today's Limited, where tons of cards have enters triggers. That said, if you're going to use it just to give your stuff like pseudo-vigilance, it's not going to be worth playing. So I think most blue decks will be able to get value out of this the turn it comes down for it to be a pretty good card, but it's not always going to happen. Like if it always happened that you got to get an enters trigger twice, a super powerful enters trigger twice when you played this, it would be a bomb because it would give you so much value right away, but there are going to be times where its effect is meaningless or close to it. So I think it's a B. So, those are all the blue cards in Final Fantasy. In the next video, I'll look at all the black ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out there, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.